You're world building for your fantasy story, and now you got to decide what your government and your politics are going to be like. Choosing the right system will enhance your story and elevate it to the next level, but choosing the wrong one is going to break everything and throw your audience off. In this video, I'll teach you everything you need to know about world building, political systems, and governments for your story. It makes sense, at least in my mind, to start with the simplest and work our way up to the more complex ones. So the first one we got is a bit of a tribal system, and those can be ran by either an elder, a chief, or a shaman, depending on what the culture is like and what they value. Maybe it's an elder if they value things like wisdom and experience. Maybe the place that they're living is dangerous for whatever reason. Maybe war or just the nature of the place itself is a threat to the inhabitants that live there. And maybe it is rare that people live to an advanced age. So anybody who does that stands out and really earns the respect of their tribe. Now, being an elder doesn't mean that somebody's the oldest per se. It just means that they're established, respected, and of a sufficient standing that other people feel like they can turn to them for answers and guidance. The people living in this kind of system would live a more grounded, no-nonsense life, probably without very much room for error. So they're not going to tolerate incompetence. If somebody isn't up for the job, it's most likely getting passed on to another whether they want it or not, and the previous elder would most likely take some kind of advisor position, assuming that they're capable of doing that and up to those kinds of tasks. If it's a chief, on the other hand, they're probably a good deal younger, and they're probably more of a take charge type of person. Does this chief get the power by seizing it for themselves, or challenging the other, like their predecessor, to a duel and beating them? Or is it more the kind of thing where a chief will appoint their successor and sort of mold them for the job and bring them up to a point where the next chief is actually capable of taking over? Do they maybe have an even simpler system where it's just hereditary and it gets passed on from like a parent to a child? Or does the tribe maybe vote on it? When it comes to shamans, or druids maybe, it would imply that your tribe is a theocracy and that spirituality is either the most important thing to them or at least one of the most important things to them. The shaman would likely be a spiritual guide, somebody that the people turn to in times of need and trust with their souls. How does the influence of this faith inform the physical shape of the settlement that they live in? What sort of motifs and symbols are there that are present in, for example, the buildings themselves, or maybe the clothes the people wear? Do they maybe carve certain designs into stone or wood, and even if it doesn't look religious at first glance, maybe it does have a deeper religious meaning to those people? Now let's zoom out a little bit. Is there maybe several villages and settlements in the nearby area, and do they stay in touch with each other? Do they convene and help govern themselves separately, but also as a single person? Do they sort of mediate disputes between different chiefdoms or whatever it is that you have? And maybe it's not that complex. Maybe they're reasonably separate, but they still convene every solstice and equinox. Maybe there's shared religious rites or social rites and passages that are sort of a team effort type of thing. Do your people in this village or tiny settlement, do they consider all of these tribes together to maybe be one people just kind of spread out? Maybe they're just not capable of surviving alone without a little bit of help and reliance on each other, and maybe they got to share certain resources or whatnot, or it's just a lot more convenient to stay in touch. Do keep in mind, though, on the topic of a tribal council, one single village or tribe or whatever can form a tribal council of their own if it makes sense. It doesn't have to be just one figurehead. A lot of times, if there are settlements that are in close proximity to each other, they will expand and sort of encroach on each other and form one greater sort of place, one bigger kind of establishment. And maybe if that happens, they then have more complex requirements and they need a more in-depth form of government. But we'll touch on that one a little bit later. For now, we're going to get into monarchies. So a monarchy is where a king or a queen rule, and this king, for example, they have the authority to make pretty much whatever decision they want without any superior to report to, at least in theory. It is said that a king or a monarch is appointed by the gods and that their rule is the gods' will. Some will take that a big step further, though, and they will declare that they themselves are a god or descended from the gods. That we especially see a lot of in the Bronze Age, people actually taking the title of God King, and sometimes they would only be envoy, that they would say, and other times they're divine straight from their coronation, straight from birth, or only after their death. Different cultures do have a sort of different way of taking that on. If the death was considered to be them rising to divinity, then it would tend to be followed by a lot of celebrations and rituals and sort of religious rites. Regardless, in a monarchy, every single piece of that kingdom that they're running is considered to be their personal property, typically. Every single bit of land, every single animal that lives there, and even every single person that lives there. If a lord was granted lands, he wasn't typically granted actual ownership of the land. He was granted stewardship of the land and the right to sort of reap the benefits of it on their monarch's behalf. In times such as that, there were a lot of rules about what you could hunt, where, and when, because, as I said, the animals were considered to be the actual personal property of the king, and unsanctioned hunting was pretty much considered theft from the king himself. There were also things called diarchies, and that's where you have two rulers of equal status, two sovereigns, you could say, two royal families. Now, if there's only one royal family, it is a monarchy. You might get confused there by the two ruler part, because king and queen, what do you mean that right there is two rulers? But the thing is, depending on whose bloodline is the actual royalty of that area, they are the only true monarch. If the king comes from the royal bloodline, the queen isn't actually the same type of queen. It's a queen consort, like just a wife that inherited the title of queen. If the queen is the actual sovereign, the actual, descendant of that area's royal bloodline, the king is not the monarch. He is, a lot of the time, he doesn't even inherit the title king. He only gets the title of prince, and his wife is the one that stays the queen. A good example of this is the British monarchy. Queen Elizabeth was married to, I think it was Prince Philip was his name, for decades. That guy never inherited the title of king. A real-life example of a diarchy is ancient Sparta. It's a well-documented fact that they had two kings, They ruled together. They were the heads of the military, the city-state, the faith, and they sat on a larger council of elders that helped them rule. These kings did have equal standing, and they were able to veto each other's decisions and tell each other no. These kings in ancient Sparta, they were granted supreme authority during times of war or major emergencies, but in normal times and peace times and whatnot, they actually were beholden to that council of elders that helped govern Sparta with them, and they were able to be punished or even put on trial by those elders if they abused their power. So why were there two kings there? Well, it's thought that what preceded ancient Sparta was actually two different places, and they sort of grew and they amassed and became one place together. And it's thought that they just both retained their own royal family, and it just sort of blended into a new system. But if you're paying attention, you'll realize that earlier I said that the kings were absolute authority. So why is it that this council of elders was allowed to check the kings like that? What I'm about to say is not Greece specific by any means. It's kind of something that we see over and over again in different regions, even ones that didn't end up in contact with each other. It's a pretty sort of universal truth of monarchies. As time goes on, people tend to get increasingly tired of monarchs abusing their power, and they start to try anything they can think of to sort of keep that abuse in check. They'll try things like assassination, supporting other claimants to the throne, overthrowing them by force, like sometimes actual coups, and sometimes they'll just straight up replace their current monarch with the monarch's child, even if they're not putting in a new line of royalty. In the end, a lot of times, in the people's opinion, their only option is to just straight up overthrow the monarchy and leave behind no people at all with any legitimate claim to a throne. That's because, when there are times where a monarchy gets overthrown, it's not like 100% of the people agree on it. There's multiple factions. Maybe you got the one faction that wants to rebel. Maybe you got the other faction that's loyal to this current king, because even if they're not the best, they have a very comfortable position there. And a lot of the times there's a third faction where they're like, okay, this king sucks. Monarchy, still the way to go. I think this guy will maybe give me some stuff that I like, or will rule the place better. In other places, they don't actually overthrow their kings. They just force them to sign stuff that limits their power. You can think, for example, of the English monarchy, yet again, the Magna Carta, which was signed in the late 1200s, I believe. They'd been trying to implement that thing for like 3 different kings, and it just never sort of came to be. But after a certain amount of time, pretty much everybody was tired of it, and even the king's supporters were kind of like, okay, it seems like this is the only way to save the king's life and keep his lineage going on, right? So they'll sign bills into law that limit their power sometimes and give more power to a parliament type of thing. But what if you don't want something where there's only one person in charge? And what if your setting is too big for something like just a council of elders to be sufficient? Then you start getting into things like senates, republics, and democracy. In its simplest form, a senate is a sort of group of aristocracy or nobility that convenes and they vote on matters of law, policy, and other facets of the day-to-day running of a place. Now, a senate can stand on its own and maybe not report to anybody, or it can also report to a monarch or something. In a lot of the history of the Roman Republic, for example, before it became an empire, the Senate was ran by two consuls who sort of presided over the meetings and ran the place. Now, they were elected, they were voted on by their peers, and they weren't able to run for back to back terms. It was a fixed term, um, like a lot of modern places, but the consuls there, the power check was that they couldn't run back to back. So I could run in election one, I cannot run in election two, and then yes, I can run in election three. Now, that was just a power check to make sure that there weren't factions that would get too ingrained or based on one figurehead, and it was sort of to prevent a new monarchy from forming. It's something to consider when you're doing a Senate or some form of democratic government is, do you want this to be what's considered a perfect democracy where everybody gets a vote, or do you want it to be a imperfect democracy where only certain people get a vote? The idea of a imperfect democracy, it's not necessarily about power all the time. A lot of the time it is, but sometimes it's actually more about making sure the person is qualified to sort of have a say on how things are ran. Example rules could be, you know, only the head of a household can vote, only a landowner can vote, only a freeman can vote, or sometimes it'll be only a noble or a member of the Senate. Something that can really enrich your fantasy world is deciding whether or not you want it to be a aristocracy or a meritocracy. Now, a nice example of that is Rome. People, even highborn people, they had to serve and prove themselves in order to earn their nobilitas, it was called. And a lot of the times people would do it by serving in the military, but there were other ways. The main thing is that for the majority of the Roman Republic and for a lot of Roman culture, your birth wasn't the number one defining thing about you. It was actually proving yourself to your peers. Ask yourself, if a person takes a position of power, is it for a set period of time or is it for life? Is it hereditary, earned, appointed by a specific person, voted on? For our final political system of the day, we're going to touch on something that is reasonably nuanced. What's the difference between a kingdom and an empire? A kingdom, relatively speaking, is on the smaller side, and culturally it's pretty similar throughout, reasonably homogenous. That lends itself to a certain amount of stability and a sense of identity. A empire, on the other hand, is something that kind of expands very aggressively and quickly, most of the time by force, of course, and it spans several peoples and ethnic groups. There are multiple identities within, and that aggression, that speed, and that sort of schism between identities and what people consider themselves to be tends to cause a lot of instability. Kingdoms will have their own rebellions and whatnot, of course, but an empire actively makes it more likely and more almost unavoidable, to be honest. Think about Rome for an example. They have Italy, they have Greece. Those are reasonably similar culturally. Now they take Egypt, which is pretty much nothing like either of them. They've got their own dynasty. Egypt has already been ruled by foreigners for centuries at this point, and they hate their foreign government, the Ptolemies, which were instilled by Alexander the Great. Cleopatra was actually a Macedonian Greek. very inbred. Uh, they also had big parts of the Middle East. They had Spain. They had France. Those areas, Spain and France, very Celtic at that time. Nothing like the Romans, and that's also the same with Germania, the province, which includes places like the Norse regions and Germany and all that. And they even went to Britain as well for a while, which at the time, of course, Celtic. Think about how massive of an area that is on the map, and you got several different ethnic groups that are nothing like each other, and a lot of them are quite unhappy about that development. So, of course, you're fighting on multiple fronts very often. I did mention Alexander the Great just a second ago. We'll touch on him again right here, just really quickly. He's from Macedonia. He takes Greece. Macedonia was kind of considered those weird off-brand Greeks at the time. They weren't, they were like, oh, those are the whack jobs. They weren't a huge fan, Greece, of Macedonia, but Alexander the Great takes all of Greece. He goes down the Near East, like the part of the Middle East that is touching the Mediterranean. They take Egypt really quickly. They go across Persia, and then they even take a bunch of kingdoms in India. Those are vastly, vastly different groups. And you'll notice the second Alexander died, his whole entire empire fell apart. A lot of that is due to the idea of him not leaving an heir, of course, and the fact that his death was super sudden. But at the same time, he was making very good steps at assimilating and making them one culture. He would marry a bunch of Persians. A bunch of his people would marry Persians. They did the same thing in Egypt to an extent too. But he didn't have enough time to assimilate truly, right? They were still different peoples, just with a couple bonds inside. One last concept I want to touch on here. Rome had several different political systems over the years. They were even ruled by foreign kings when they were like a tiny sort of city-state, just foreign people that weren't Roman or Latin at all. It did start out with their own line of kings, but through some political maneuvering and whatnot, eventually the Etruscans took over and became the kings for a certain amount of time. I believe it was only 3 kings. I believe that Rome had 7 at the start. The last 3, to my understanding, were Etruscan. And that went so bad, and they hated it so much that they overthrew their monarchy, decided they would never ever have a king ever again, and that they would start a republic. Then you fast forward 500 years, the Romans appoint Julius Caesar dictator for life, and that's a rule. That's a role that's only supposed to be held for like 6 months, but his again for life. Then Julius Caesar is killed, and his status and his power passes on to his nephew, and that's how the empire started. Augustus Caesar is considered to be the first emperor. Because they gave them the title of imperator. That's what the English word emperor comes from. And at first, the emperors did everything they could to hide their power. They didn't want it to be obvious to the people. They wanted the people to sort of get used to being led by one guy for a while. And they wanted to let them be able to sort of tell themselves that it's not just one dude ruling over everything. Fast forward a couple emperors, and they don't even care. They're actively throwing it in people's faces. Hey, I'm the emperor. I can do anything, and you can't do a thing about it. And then by the time that happened, it was too late. Something to note here too, each of those 3 political systems that Rome went through, They left a mark on their people for a very extended period of time and influenced their culture, their society for generations. Try integrating that into your fantasy stories if you have several that take place over a extended period of time, especially if it's over centuries or whatnot. How does it grow and alter and influence, and what sort of marks and hints are left behind from previous structures that were once in place? How does your setting evolve? Now, that's all I have for today, so if you got any questions, make sure to leave them down in the comments section below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.